Welcome to the Vinyl Verdict, and I've got legendary sound engineer Andrew Morris, who worked at Olympic Studios and was inside the sessions for Badfinger, which is the big one, why we're here today, but also, not to be forgotten, David Bowie, Rolling Stones, many, many more. We'll cover a lot of those.
As an assistant.
As a tape
Engineer,
operator.
yeah, junior.
That's true, but you supported them. Badfinger fans will recognize you were also immortalized in the Joey Mall and Kathy Mullen song Andy Norris. So a little bit of a misspelling there, which we'll get into. And since that time, you're involved in artist management. So we'll talk about your time as a manager and just overall. Thanks for being here, Andrew. Excited to talk to you.
Yeah, well, more than welcome.
So to kick it off, take me back to like how you even got involved in music, because it's been a long journey. What was your first kind of exposure to music, and what was the scene like at that time?
I wasn't a very good student at school, I must admit, but that allowed me to get involved with the music community in London. I used to go down to record companies and get press kits and, make friends with people in the record companies. I was like 14 and a half at the time. And my introduction into the music industry as a business was when I got my first job in 1970, working for a small little label called Dick James Music. It was a small publisher, but they had the Beatles, Northern Songs, and they had Elton John. And Elton John was signed to Dick James Music as well as his publishing was. So I worked there for almost a year. I was basically a messenger boy, did odd jobs. I'd go and pick up Elton's clothes at the dry cleaner's passport at the US consulate. I went to some of the very first shows that Elton did in London at the BBC when Your Song came out. Just immersed myself in working around people that were probably like 7 or 8 years older than me, like Bernie Taupin, Gus Dudgeon, Paul Buckmaster, the arranger, all the people who worked at Dick's. And then while I was working at Dick's, I was told that there was a job in a recording studio in London. This is before Olympic. It was called Command Studios. And so I got a job there for around 6, 7 months. And again, it was an entry level position. And then finally I got a job offer at Olympic Studios in London, which was basically Abbey Road's competition. There were lots of really other great studios in London at the time. I mean, there was obviously Trident and Delangley, Morgan Studios, but a lot of huge records were done at Olympic. Stones, Eagles' first record was recorded there, believe it or not, with Glenn Johns, Zeppelin Bear Company, yeah, Jimi Hendrix. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. It's just, it was a profound studio.
I mean, there's a little bit of a separation in 1970 between the recording of music and live performances. Did you gravitate naturally towards the recording side a little bit more in terms, I mean, you could have also kind of been supporting, I guess, sound mixing for live shows. Was that a natural thing for you?
It was, you know what, I think there is such a stark difference between live, like you said, and recording in the studio. Yeah, I gravitated towards it. I was kind of flying blind because I was really young. When you're 15 years old, you're just like, you're in it, but you're not realizing or you're not grasping how amazing of a time it was and a situation that 50 years on is now look back and, people say to you, wow, I can't believe you were in the studio with these bands and you were in this place where lots of people today will never ever get to really be involved in that. It was just a magical time, and the bands that were coming into Olympic, like Bear Company and Zeppelin, they were my idols growing up. I mean, Zeppelin was the band that I would go and see as much as I could. Saw them at the Marquee Club in London in
Yeah,
front of 200 people. It was
it's unbelievable.
mind blowing. Imagine seeing Led Zeppelin in a roadhouse. I
Yeah.
mean, the Marquee wasn't a roadhouse, but it
No,
felt
those
like
are,
it was at the time. Yeah, no, I mean, live was always very important. I mean, for me as a music lover, I felt like if you couldn't cut it live, then you know you're probably at a disadvantage
mm,
as an artist. But no, the studio side of it was always interesting because I didn't only work with rock bands. I worked with like Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber on the soundtrack for Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So you were thrown into various situations. I was lucky enough to work on full records, like I worked with Hawkwind, which Lemmy was a big part of that band, and like Badfinger. And then you were put on sessions, like I was put on a couple of sessions with the Stones for It's Only Rock and Roll, but I wasn't put on the whole record. And it was just
mm,
because one of the main assistant engineers that was working on the record at the time got in a motorcycle accident. So I was put on the vocals for the song "It's Only Rock and Roll" with the Stones.
That's a door that just opened. If you get an opportunity like that, you got to take it.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, you just you get put on whatever they tell you you're going to get put on. Especially with me, I was just a junior assistant engineer, so basically, I had to cut my teeth on learning process of recording and making tape copies and master copies of records. And then you got to know, I got to know personally some of the people. I got to know Ronnie Wood pretty well back then. Yeah, it was a really incredible time. There was so much fusion of different elements of music going on. There was like, ska reggae music was becoming really big at the
Mhm.
time. And then the glam rock thing just absolutely exploded.
Yeah, I mean, I think the music scene in London as a whole at that time is lightning in a bottle, but going in the studio is like lightning in a bottle, probably even more so. So that's pretty
Yeah.
cool. I want to give you some credit also for just the technical skill set that was required to do tape operation at that time. I don't know if that skill set even exists today. I mean, maybe there's some collectors out there who would know how to do it, but what was the process once you got a role like that? How did you kind of, learn what to do? How much did you have to customize it to each artist?
To be very honest with you, I'm surprised I even got the job. There were so many people that were well more versed in recording. I mean, we didn't have recording institutes back then in the 70s, right? You just got your job and you came up through the ranks of making like tea, and then you'd be put on sessions, which is what I did. I was put on making tape copies to tape copies. It's really not very difficult. You press play on one button, record on the other, and you make a copy of the master and you put it in the vault, and there's the copy. Just sitting in the studio and learning how to put quarter inch, plugs into quarter inch holes, which would link up to a track. And then I think the hardest part of everything was learning how to use the microphones. Like we had U87 Neumanns, which was a standard and still is today for recording, had pencil mics for drums. And then you really got thrown into the deep end. And, I made a bunch of mistakes. I raised one of Peter Frampton's tracks on his record when I was just told to make copies. And fortunately for me, they had a master backup. Otherwise, I probably would never be talking to you right now.
Right. Well, that's what I was
Um,
going to say. Is it's pretty highly consequential if you record on the wrong side of the tape, or you I don't know, there's some interference or something on one of the mics. I mean, no IT support's going to come in and bail you out, right?
no, the funny thing about Olympic was, unlike some other studios at the time, like the Neve console, Rupert Neve's famous console, which is obviously still highly regarded as one of the best ever. Olympics, all their consoles were handmade by the maintenance guys. So there were modules that would slide in and out, and you could pick a module out and send it down to the workshop. The guys would solder on the parts that were needed to be fixed that would break down, and they slide the module back in. And that was how Olympic worked. It was really unique unto itself. The guys like walking around white lab coats like they were scientists that were basically, fixing these boards. But whatever they did, um, they made these boards sound amazing. I mean, you had EMI Abbey Road had the same thing. They had these guys walking around in white lab coats, but they had brand name consoles, at the time. Like Trident had a Trident board, EMI, had the Neve console, and then later on in the mid to late 70s, you had the SSL company come out, Solid State Logic. But Olympic was all like hands on, and when we did the vocals for It's Only Rock and Roll, I was told to take a snake down to the toilet and put up two microphones for Mick and Keith. And basically, we used the toilet as an ambient echo chamber for
Wow.
their vocals. And yeah, that's how it worked. All the toys and stuff that you have today back then
Yeah.
were really not there. It was recording engineers at their best,
Yeah.
splicing tapes and editing tapes and like doing this kind of thing with the tape to try and have a perfect splice. So the songs or the pieces of songs that they wanted to cut out I was always having to put like quarter-inch pieces of tape on my shoulder when the recording engineer Keith Harwood would splice the tapes and make like a chorus or a verse shorter.
Hmm.
And then if it worked, great, and if it didn't, you had this piece of tape, and we saved those little pieces of tape in boxes in case of the event that anywhere down the road they wanted to redo it or make it longer or whatever.
Yeah.
So it was a different way of recording back then. The introduction of 24 track machines was just becoming available, but we were syncing up to 16 tracks to make it 32 at that point. But yeah, it was really an interesting time, and the sound engineers from back then really were just absolutely incredible. I mean, they were flying by wire as well, you know.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of creativity, I think, and like we stand on the shoulders of giants. I mean, every plugin and reverb and everything is trying to recreate what they were figuring out for the first time then. So it's,
Absolutely.
would you say that was like the greatest kind of technological leap forward while you were as a tape op? Would you say it was like the 24 track or?
Well, I think the 24 track was because then it made it available that you could put 48 on it by splitting one track into two. We started using a lot of effects units that were being built by new companies in not only in the UK but in the States as well, versus analog gear. But analog gear was so warm, and I mean the amount of warmth you could get out of tube microphones and tube amplifiers was being pushed to the limit, I think, by a lot of recording engineers at that time. That's why the sound was so fat, you know.
Mm. Were you involved in cutting the acetates at like the end of the day if somebody wanted a copy to take home as well? Or
No, but I was involved. I was involved in the sense that Olympic didn't have a mastering lab, but when I worked at Command Studios, I was trying to absorb as much information as I could about learning how to cut discs. You know, we had Roxy Music had just recorded Virginia Plain, and they were mastering it at Command because it was one of the first studios beside Trident that had a mastering lab. Mastering a record back then, the machines that did it were extremely expensive. So there were dedicated places in London where they would master records, just like Sterling Lab, I guess, in the United States. Mastering a record is such an important part of the business, and today it's obviously changed. But I've been in a lot of mastering sessions in New York at the former Power Station, which was an incredible studio in New York where Bon Jovi did a lot of stuff, and Eric Clapton, Dire Straits, and I'd sit in a mastering lab with that spanned the Brilliant Mistakes, a great band from New York at the time, and we had mastered two records there, and it was really amazing to see how much was added to the record after it was recorded in the studio and brought into the mastering lab, and it would just make the album sound so much different and full and alive, and that is an art unto itself. And I'm really surprised that I don't see more interviews with people that master records.
Yeah.
An artist needs to learn about that as well, how it's done, breaking down the tracks, putting EQ and compression on. Yeah, it's an incredible part of the recording side of the business.
It's a fine art. I mean, that's why it's hard to believe. I think a lot of artists aren't even present for the mastering sometimes, right? That's
That's
probably why
crazy
they
to
don't
me.
even meet.
Yeah,
They don't meet each other.
yeah,
So it's
that's
amazing.
crazy.
Pretty critical, I think, for any fans watching this. I mean, you were really there in a inflection point of history, people would say, for Diamond Dogs on that album. So can you speak a little bit to what was it like to be in the studio with Bowie? What did that kind of feel like? What stuck with you after all?
Well, I'll tell you how I got on the session again, which probably wasn't. I never dreamt in a million years I'd get put on that record, but I was in the studio on a Saturday. It was very rare that Olympic was open on the weekend, but I had to go in and make some tape copies for a session on Monday morning. So I got in, and we had this giant board with all the three studios and all the people that were coming in. It was chopped up into weeks for the month, and the phone rang. I picked it up, and there was this person on the phone, and I didn't realize it. I didn't know it was David Bowie, and he called up, and it wasn't out of the norm for people to call up and say, I want to book the studio for a month. It was usually bands like the Stones would block book it for, like, 4 or 5 weeks. Sometimes they wouldn't even turn up, but they still booked it, and yet they'd have to pay for it. He said, I want to know if Studio 2 is going to be open. And I said, well, I don't know. I said, on the board right now, it looks blank, but you'll have to call the studio manager on Monday morning. The studio manager, her name was Sandy, and she was totally on her job. She knew everything about what she was doing. Anyway, it was a brief discussion for about 5 minutes, and at the end of the call, he said, "What's your name?" And I said, "My name's Andy Morris." And he said, "Okay." And I said, "Who is this?" And he goes, "It's David Bowie." And I was like, "Okay." I put the phone down, and then Monday morning, um, I walked into Olympic, and then Sandy called me into the office, and I thought I've done something wrong again. And she said, "I'm going to put you on a session with David Bowie." And I was like, wow. So 3 days later, 4 days later, I think it was 4 or 5 days later, in walks David with all these incredible people. And we ended up working on Diamond Dogs. And if someone was to ask me what was one of the biggest letdowns of working in the music business, what was something that really made you very upset? And it was that working with David, not only did I work on Diamond Dogs, but I actually worked with his backing band with Ava Cherry, who was one of his singers in his background band. And anyway, I worked with David a long time. Went to his Christmas party at his house in 1973, and he invited me to stay at his house for 2 weeks because I lived on the other side of London. He said to me, "Where'd you go on that little motorcycle of yours every night after the sessions?" Usually it was like 4 o'clock in the morning, and I told him I lived about 45 minutes from the studio, which was in South London. And, I had this little rice burner 50cc bike. So it took me about an hour and a half to get home. And then he said, why don't you put your bike away? And he goes, why don't you come and stay at my house in Chelsea with me and Angela? And that was Angela Bowie. This is way before he was married to Aman. And so I stayed at David's house. And every night I'd get in his black limousine and I'd go to his house and I stayed in the spare bedroom upstairs and everything was catered. I'd fresh breakfast and fruit in the morning. Now, mind you, I just came from a two person family. It was just me and my mum. And to be thrown into that, I think that was the first time I was really thrown into wealth and like all the trimmings that went along with it. The car was one of them for sure. it's
Yeah,
kind
I
of surreal,
can't.
it's kind of surreal, man. When you talk about it now, you work. Yeah, it was just amazing, and I got to work with him for a long time. But then when the record came out, I was in Philadelphia, and I went to a store at the time. It was called Sam Goody's in
Yeah.
Philly. It was a record chain, and I ran to the store, opened up Diamond Dogs record, and lo and behold, my name was not on the record, and it really destroyed me because after you work on a record like that, you're just like you're trying to imagine the kind of pat on the back that you would get from somebody like that. And he was
Yeah.
very nice to me. David was always super super nice. And then many years later, I kind of got my retribution in some sense because a bunch of tape boxes started coming up online on all these blogs and stuff, and then there and behold, there was a bunch of masters found from Olympic, and my name was on the right hand side of the box. The reason my name was on it was because I wrote it. There's my name, and it had the date and everything. And it was just a mistake that someone made, probably at Main Man, David Bowie's management company at the time. Or it could have been someone at RCA that got the information, forgot to put it on. And that happened to a lot of other tape ops. Even if you were just partially put on a record, usually most bands or solo artists would, they give you the credit. It's just an engine. I'm on the Hawkwind album.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting with all these archive releases. Hopefully, you're getting a little more credit when they go back and actually check it. But at the time, it's so rushed, and it's just someone, at the label writing liner notes, and they probably skip over half the people in the
Yeah,
acknowledgments or spell them wrong anyway. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
what about from the other side? Because I like covering some of the psychology of actually being this close and working on a record, and then it comes out and the artist moves on, right? How did you kind of navigate that emotionally of like being so intimate with someone in the studio and then potentially never working with them again?
That's why I left Olympic. There was only three bands that I actually really got to hang out with as a young kid while I was working at Olympic was Badfinger, a band called the Pretty Things, when they were in the studio and Robert Plant, Jimmy Page signed them to Swan Song, and obviously Bowie, and so obviously Badfinger was the one that I got to know through Joey, and I've been lifelong friends with Joey up until unfortunately he just passed recently. Our lives had always intertwined, and I always kept in touch with Joe. With Bowie, it was like coming off of this high. It's probably when people ask bands, what's it like to play in front of 100,000 people, and then you come off stage and then you go back to your hotel, and then some of them say it's very lonely,
Mm.
or they say, I just don't know where to get that buzz once I come off stage, because it's such a high for some people. I don't mean that on an ego basis. I just think it's a fuel driven experience that you have when you're performing in front of people like that, and the excitement, what you give and what you take back from the crowd that's there. Like I said earlier on, for like 2 hours, you give it your best. They receive it, you give it, and it's such an incredible feeling. Even though I was never really in a band that went anywhere, it's something you have to be really grateful for because you
Hmm.
don't know how long you're in it for.
Yeah.
When I first was in New York for the first few months, my friend Keith Harwood, who had just come off working with the Stones, he was actually, unfortunately, he was killed in a car crash in London while I was in New York. He worked at Olympic. He did a bunch of records that I was on. I went to the record plant in New York, and there was three record plants. There was one in San Francisco, one in Los Angeles. The two on the West Coast were owned by a guy called Chris Stone, who was an engineer producer. So he owned both of those studios. But the one in New York was owned by a guy called Roy Cicala, Italian guy, who was quite crazy. But he asked me if I had a place to stay in New York, and at the time, I was staying in this really horrible hotel on the east side of Manhattan. So he said, "Look, if you don't mind sleeping in a storage room, you can sleep in the studio until you get your feet off the ground." So while I was in the studio, while I was living in this makeshift storage unit with a bunch of music gear, and I sleep underneath the piano blanket, John Lennon was in the next room recording with Shelley Yakis, who did a lot of stuff with Tom Petty later on. And then there was a young recording engineer that I'd see out in the foyer every day. And he was a young guy, and his name was Jimmy Iovine. Yeah, I know, it's crazy.
Wow.
I never saw Lennon, though. It's funny, all the whole time I was there, I was living in that studio probably for about 8 weeks. It was very short, and then I got my own little place downtown. But I never saw him, but I could always hear him,
That's crazy. Did
whatever.
you feel
Anyway,
intimidated about like New York studios compared to Olympic, or it was like same level, or how did you feel like best
same
practices came
level.
from London over? Yeah.
Same level, same kind of intensity, big names always walking in. I mean, huge, huge bands. And you have to remember back then there were budgets. I mean, the budgets that basically probably ruined half of the record business, but there were huge budgets. I mean, it wasn't unheard of for a band to get like, 150, $200,000 record deal.
Did you meet any of the other Beatles at Olympic ever? Did they come in for?
No, I didn't meet any of the Beatles at Olympic, but I did meet George Harrison with Joey Apple. For the life of me, I can't remember the reason why we went to Apple. Oh, I know, because Apple had a mastering lab. Joey had said that he was going to Apple, and I believe he was going there to pick up some tapes. And I had never been into Apple before, even though when I worked for Elton's label, I used to go up to George Martin's office all the time, Air London, to pick up. There was kind of this kumbaya relationship between Dick James, the person, and his son Stephen James, who was running Dick James Music, and George Martin. And so I would see George up there quite a lot. I'd go and pick up messages or boxes and stuff. But I did stay at Ringo's house in LA in 1977 through a chance meeting for a party he was putting on. I saw George at Apple briefly for literally 5 minutes. That I was pretty.
Starstruck.
Yeah, I was. I saw him in the corner. He had like, his All Things Must Pass had already come out, so he did have the beard. I was over there for 5 minutes. I walked into the room, and there was George sitting at the console with a bunch of guys, and then I left. But then I got to meet Ringo in LA, and that was a pretty extraordinary experience.
I know you've spoken at University of Hawaii. I've seen some of the other articles. I know you were part of history. You intersected with all of these artists. You haven't told the Badfinger story before, so I want to give you a platform to get into all of that, and maybe starting with how did you meet them? Was it just like their name popped up on that board at Olympic, or did you have a pre-existing friendship with?
No, no, I just was put on, like working with David, with the exception of the phone call. I just was put on the session. I got to know all of them really well, and they were funny, 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 funny. That's what came to mind. Someone asked me what it was like working with him. It was great. It was great. I spent a lot of time with Joey and his wife Kathy at the time, and I'd go to their house in Camden Town. I went to Peter's house a couple of times when he lived. I think it was in Finchley, and got to know the roadies really well. Got to see them in concert in the UK. A couple of, I think they were just like tryout shows they were doing.
That's what I was gonna. So what a scattering of shows they did towards the end of '73. So you must have been at a couple of those in London,
Yeah,
almost concurrent with the album.
yeah. I think one of the shows was in London, and I think another show I went to was somewhere up north, but I can't recall.
When I look at the recording sessionography, I mean, they went in and finished the last sessions for Ass, took a month or two off, and went back to Olympic and did the next Warner album. So even though there was this emotional transition, it seems like their day to day was recording songs in the same place.
But can you imagine like jumping off of that boat and really jumping into an unknown boat, which was Warner Brothers? That must have been really, really hard psychologically for Peter to be able to deal, because there is a song that he wrote about that. I think it was like, for me, it was like meeting the Beatles because they were really funny. Joey had this wicked sense of humor about him that was just boyish. If you see one of the Badfinger, I think it's Baby Blue. Joey looks over at the cameraman and he does this really goofy face and shakes his hair, and then Tommy's looking at him like, "What? You're absolutely a fucking nutcase. What are you doing? We're on national TV and you're pulling these stupid faces." But I mean, the Beatles used to do it. Look at Ringo and John. They always used to make those stupid faces, and that's why I think that's why people loved them. They felt like they were normal, even though they were huge icons in music, and they were very talented. Joey was a really underrated guitar player. I don't really think he even got the recognition he deserved. He's a great player. I think the pinnacle of their career, when you look at the handcrafted songs that were written, even with McCartney contributing one of the songs were timepieces. They're time capsules now, yeah,
Mhm.
for all time, for the band and just for music lovers around the world. Those songs, are everywhere. But I think creatively, the best record I think they ever did, to me, it's just mind blowing how great it is, was the next record
I agree.
they
I'm with
did.
you.
Wish You Were Here?
Yeah. I'm with you.
Oh my God. The
Yeah,
songs on that album, man, and the strings. Chris Thomas did that as well. The same.
yeah. I think, and that's one that has grown with time. It was kind of mired, I think, by like the circumstances of its release and everything. But now there are real. I think there's real debates to be had, and the community is pretty divided between that and Straight Up as the best album.
Yeah, no one knows it. The song, no one knows
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
There's that Japanese girl that sings
It's
that, and
amazing.
in the meantime,
Yeah.
in time, with time, in the meantime. It's like the whole record is like, wow.
Yeah.
That to me is like Dark Side of the Moon for me for Badfinger. It's just one of those records that if people don't know it, go out and buy it.
The way it
That
was
was done at
done.
Caribou Ranch.
Yeah. Yeah. So you weren't you weren't part of that one. You were already back in. You were in New York already then.
I was in New York when that
Okay.
was done. Yeah, I wish in hindsight I would have bought a plane ticket and gone out to Caribou when they were doing that. They were doing that record actually. The history behind that studio is Jimmy Guercio, who produced all the Chicago records, had that studio in in Colorado, Caribou Ranch, which became one of the first real recording studios that was not in LA or Muscle Shoals or in New York. It was in the mountains, and it was an incredible studio. Apparently, I mean, they had some really serious gear in there. And then, I didn't speak to Joey for about 3 years. They went through. Well, I didn't speak to Joey for 3 years because Peter killed himself. And then Joey stopped playing music. He was a carpet layer in LA
Yeah.
because they had no money. They were broke.
Unbelievable.
They had no
Yeah.
money, man. Joey was just trying to survive. Yeah. And when that record came out, it didn't do very well. The first one. I don't think the second one did very well either, to be honest with you.
Well, it was pulled, right? Never got a chance. They say it was climbing up the charts, but yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you about just being in the studio with them because you're the first person I've ever talked to who's actually in. I mean, that's such an intimate setting. Like, was there pressure? Because you always hear about how they were following up. They felt the pressure and the weight of these previous singles and the commercial pressure to perform at that level. Did you see that they were like trying to write a hit or anything like that?
No, and to be quite frank with you, I was so young. I was only 16 when I worked with them.
Yeah.
Um, I didn't really know about the ongoing situation that they were all actually going through. I mean, Tommy was driving around in a beautiful Porsche, living in Surrey, in a, beautiful place to live. I think, there were probably there was a lot of internalizing going on with each individual as to like where this was all going. Because mind you, when that record was being recorded, and even after it was even after they left the studio, I think that was really the beginning of the end for them. I'd speak to Joey like once every 3 or 4 months on the phone, and then when that album came out with Rainy Day Man, I was like, man, that song's got ELO written all over it. It's great. I mean that as a compliment. I mean, I could hear I thought Jeff Lynne had produced it, and it turns out it was Mark
Yeah.
Hudson. And Mark's great too. I mean, he's worked with Ringo and loads of people. But when that record came out and I heard Rainy Day Man, I was like, oh my God, this is such a great song. There's Badfinger right there.
Yeah.
That's a Badfinger song, right? I mean, those guitar parts, those are Badfinger Beatles guitar parts, right?
Yeah.
You obviously can tell by listening to it, the influence from the Beatles is all over that song. And Joey had called me and he goes, Andy, I've got this record coming out, you know, I mean, Joey was doing it all independently. I mean, and so I said, "Well, what do you need me to help you with?" And he goes, "Well, can we just like get it out there, and can you help me maybe with the publishing? I do a lot of pitching for TV and film. That's one of the big
Mm.
money makers for sound merchants. We have this great network of people in the TV and film industry that I network with literally every day, and you know." As typical record company, publishing company, Warner Chappell, has the publishing for some of the songs. I said, Joey, well, who's pitching your songs for TV and film? This is way before Breaking Bad came out. And he said to me, well, he goes, we got Warner Chappell. And I said, well, can you tell me what they're doing for you? Pitching music for TV and film isn't rocket science. It's like being a carpet salesman. You have to know the right people and you have to be very aggressive and you have to keep going in those doors and pounding away at all the companies and production houses. And eventually someone is going to listen to what you've got if it's good, based on your musical interest and background. And Joey said, well, Warner Chappell haven't really done anything for us. And I said, well, is there a go-to person there that I can talk to? I've been in the business long enough. I can talk to anyone. I don't care who they are. I mean, they've got a job. I've got a job. My job is looking after my clients. He goes, well, how about, I make a call to London and talk to the people at Warner Chappell. I said, yeah, go for it. Tell the guy what I've done. He can call up the senior vice president of ASCAP in LA and New York, and they'll give me a glowing review. They're very close friends of mine. And he goes, okay. And then like a week later, he gets this really contrite email back, which he shared with me. And the guy from Warner Chappell is absolutely under no circumstances is Andy Morris allowed to pitch any music catalog on behalf of Badfinger and Warner Chappell. And, there's somebody that probably has not been in the business as long as I have, half a lifetime. And it's probably not really busting his balls or her balls to go out there and try and get Joey's music into whatever. That's part of the business now. You have to wear every single cap if
Yeah.
you're a good manager. I felt really, really bad for him, and then like 4 months later, he calls me up 2 days before Breaking Bad. He goes, Andy, I don't know what to do. And I said, what's going on? I thought something was wrong with him. And he goes, I'm going to be on the closing soundtrack for Breaking Bad. And I said, Joe, why didn't you tell me this like 2 months ago? I said, I would have called everybody I knew up in the music business and gotten you free press. Because when you have that kind of press,
Yeah.
you use it to get press,
That makes
right?
sense. Yeah.
That's what good PR people do. If they've got something they can milk it, you better do it while it's hot.
Sure.
And unfortunately, that was not the case. And so I never really got a chance to exploit Joe's music. And I think Rainy Day Man, and I just spoke to Mary, Joey's partner, a few weeks ago, that song is going to get picked up by someone. And I hope it's not going to be someone that's going to get a no from Warner Chappell. I mean, that song is deserving of a life within the TV and film industry. It's a fantastic song.
So then you were telling me about you went out and how does it work as a tape op? So you're there until the last session, and then it's like, okay, Badfinger's done. They've recorded the last song. They move on. You kind of move on, and then what? 6 months later, you buy the vinyl and you hear it, and it sounds completely different. What was your reaction from that Warner album?
For the Warner record, you mean? I know. I was very surprised. I mean, I think that a lot of people kind of got out of the way. When it came to listening to them after that whole thing happened. I
Mm,
think that it was monumental, obviously, that Peter killed himself. No discussion. It was just like the saddest thing because he was such a lovely man. He was such a lovely man. He was very quiet, but he had this twinkle in his eye. Even at 16, you get to reflect on people's personality, and now that I'm older, I think about those moments, and they're impregnated in your brain forever. I think Peter was the intellect out of the band. He was like a poet, he was like a poet. And
mhm.
not to say the other members weren't either. They were in their own individual way. I'm just talking specifically about him. He was like Peter was like this poet, this Welsh poet. And they were doing it for all the right reasons. When you look at some of the documentaries out there, they were just exploring their life, and writing it down and recording it. And I think that's what's great about storytellers. Even with Badfinger, there's some really serious music on that last record, on Wish You Were Here record. There was some really poignant songs that were really heart tugging on that record.
It's interesting you compare it to that. It seems like when you were on, this first Warner Brothers album, it didn't maybe have that same punch that you were expecting. Like it was a bit of a
No,
letdown.
it didn't flow. It had
Yeah.
no flow. You're
That's what they
right.
call it Badfinger's White Album, and then they were all working on different songs.
Yeah, Give It Up was a really heavy song.
Yeah. Oh
Give
yeah.
It Up. That was such a
I
great
just
song.
covered that actually with my friend. Yeah, and it's yeah, I posted it. It's really distorted to get that level of distortion. I mean, it is practically like Ozzy Osbourne level distortion in '73.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Yeah, Joey got some incredible sounds on that record. I think, they were expecting that album was kind of going to be a breakthrough album for them on Warner Brothers. And Ted Templeman, the record producer at Warner Brothers at the time in LA, he was like the go-to person with Mo Austin that really was, they were the decision makers at Warner's at the time. But, when that whole thing was going on with Warner Brothers and they were like the pinnacle of the music business, Badfinger kind of got lost in.
Well, it seems like a great place to be also, but clearly, like they never made that transition, even
And
from the
then they ended up
moment.
suing Badfinger.
Yeah, right. Well, but what's interesting is we hear the fallout of this decision, and it's building and build. You were there on day one, and it wasn't clicking. Like I mean, they go in the studio that first day, and it's just still, it's not there, the momentum and everything, and then how weird is it that the singles from that album were "I Miss You" and "Love Is Easy"? Did you have any idea that was the case there, or was that also a surprise?
Surprise, I think.
I don't think they
Yeah.
knew, but I don't know if you were cutting, like moving more transfers on those songs or anything where it was even.
Well, you know what's weird? I often wonder, and the only people that are ever going to be able to bring this to light are the people that probably know more than I do, and there are certainly a lot more people that know more than I do when it comes to some of the songs. I believe that they had more songs than the songs they put on the record. There were times where we would just stick on like Phil, the engineer on the Badfinger. He was the engineer, but Chris produced it.
Yeah, that's Phil
Um,
Chapman, right?
Phil Chapman, yeah.
We always heard the story of like, they played on, well, Pete and Tom played on it, Don't Come Easy, Joey and Tom played on Imagine, all things like that. It's a very interesting anecdote that you mentioned of going with Joey to George Harrison or to get the acetate and run into him because that must have been 73. If that's when you met him, it would have
Yeah,
been once they already left Apple. And that
yeah,
very
yeah,
well
yeah.
might have been the last time you ever met him in person.
Yeah, I think that was probably the last time. It was really strange because my friend Jeremy, he was working at the time for a clothing manufacturer in London called Jean Machine, and I believe I took him up to Air Studios because George Martin at that time had opened up Air Studios, and Jeff Emerick was the head recording engineer at Air London who had worked with the Beatles, Abbey Road.
Mm.
And I think what had happened was I think Olympic was booked or we had to master something. And I think Air London had a mastering lab, but it was booked or it wasn't even open. And Apple was literally a stone's throw away from Air London.
Hmm.
And that's when I went in and
And by 73, I mean, most of the Beatles wouldn't have stepped into Apple Studios. So that's what's amazing is that George was there. Maybe, I mean, I guess he would have been doing Living in the Material World or something.
I don't know. I
Mhm.
mean, the studio was still there.
Yeah,
I mean, they hadn't closed the studio at that point. Who knows, man?
fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was still technically, and still is to this day, according to Joey, Apple Corp is still a fledgling business.
I didn't get a chance to ask you directly. What was it like working with like Chris Thomas, or what's the dynamic between a tape op and like a producer?
Oh man. Well, sometimes it can be incredible, and sometimes it can be really horrible. I never had an experience with anyone I didn't like. Chris Thomas now lives in Australia.
Oh,
After 40 years, I just hooked up with Tommy's wife, who lives
oh,
in Germany,
yeah,
Marianne. She's a lovely woman. I always loved her. She was so great. She's originally from Germany, married Tommy, and they live together. And she is still in touch with Chris. I
yeah.
just said to her recently, if you see Chris, please tell him I said hello. And he comes to the UK apparently once a year. I think he's a little bit of a recluse, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, look, you can burn yourself out and just want to have a normal life. Chris was very young when I was working with him. I think he was like 25.
Wow, that's crazy.
26. And then he went on after, I mean, his biggest legacy after he worked with Badfinger, he went on to produce the first three Pretenders records, I think, or the first two, the big ones with, Sobbing. And then he produced all the In Excess records.
Yeah,
And then went on to Elton. How big can you get,
yeah, yeah.
Um, so, yeah, working with Chris was great. He was funny. As a Badfinger story, I'll share with you, and only people that were there knew about this. And I regret one thing. The other thing I don't regret, but the one thing I really, really regret is I had a Gibson Les Paul Sunburst that my mom bought for me in London, and we didn't have any money, my mum and I. And my mom got enough money, and she said, "Let's go into London and buy you a guitar." I was taking guitar lessons in 1970, and so we went into this store, and there was this Gibson Les Paul, and it was about £200. Sunburst, 1970 Gibson, God. And I wanted to buy my aeroplane ticket to come over to the States. And I knew that making £26 a week would really not get me very far on TWA. So I had this guitar and a motorcycle, the motorcycle that I told you earlier on used to ride back to my house. And I sold Tommy my motorcycle. And then Marianne just said to me a couple of months ago, she goes, "Oh yeah," she goes, "I used to ride that all through the country village in Surrey, for years after you sold it to Tommy." Tommy came up to my house with a pickup truck, and I think I sold him the motorcycle for like £60. Um,
What? 60
and then he saw my guitar in my bedroom, and he goes, "How much do you want for that?" And I said, "I'm not selling you that."
pounds?
And he goes, "Everything's got a price, Andy lad." And I was like, "Oh man, well, how much do you want?" And I think I sold it for something stupid like £100. There's my airline ticket right there. And I sold him that Gibson Les Paul. Do you think I regret it? It would be worth a fortune today.
Yeah,
And it was just the nostalgic value of having a guitar from 1970.
yeah.
But the story about about the whole band and Chris Thomas in particular was Tommy and Marianne had this really cool house on a river. I think it was the River Thames where it really became really narrow into Surrey. I could be wrong, but I think it was. And they were having a party at their house, like a summer party. And, everyone used to like knocking a few back. And the time I got to the house, the guys in the Average White Band were there. And they were in Olympic too when Badfinger was in the other room. And this was the first record with a bum on it, with Pick Up the Pieces. Da, 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 da. That song, which became huge all over the world.
Right.
And so everyone was getting pretty lit. And then Chris was there, and Tommy turned on the garden hose and brought it into the house, literally soaked his whole house to pieces. And then we all started grabbing everything that was on the food table. We went into the fridge, got jars of mayonnaise, and it was like a scene out of Animal House.
That's what it sounds like. I was gonna say.
Yeah, and then Chris was like doing all this stuff. I don't know what he was doing. Putting hair dryers into the bathtub and just
Jesus.
crazy shit. And then one of the guys from it was the drummer from the Average White Band. Tommy stole one of his shoes and put it in the river that was flowing, and the shoe was just like going down the river. And the guy from the Average White Band, the drummer, was so drunk he jumped into the river and almost drowned, trying to rescue his shoe. But we were also messed up that everybody thought everything was really funny, which actually was quite dangerous because he could have drowned.
No, it's the kind of stuff that's only funny 50 years later. It shouldn't be funny at the time.
Yeah, yeah. Chris was great. He was a really great guy to work with. I mean, God bless him. He was one of the few. I know I never worked with any record producers I didn't like. I worked with Andy Johns, Glyn Johns' younger brother, who
Oh,
unfortunately died. He died of I think he died of a cocaine overdose. He was great. All right, so little antidote for Elton story here.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Give me that. I didn't
All right,
ask about
I'll
Elton.
give you two stories. One was hysterically funny, and I just actually rekindled my friendship with him because I hadn't spoken to him for God since I was working in Elton's label. So I was asked to go to the printers in Fleet Street in London, which was like the main street where all the big printing houses in London were for businesses and stuff. Blue Jean Baby, LA Lady, seamstress for the band. So that was Bernie's wife, Maxine. Right. So when he wrote the lyrics, Blue Jean Baby, LA Lady, seamstress for the band, Bernie was married to Maxine, who was from Los Angeles. And so Maxine was a seamstress, and she made Man Across the Water logo on that jean jacket. On a jean jacket, she actually embroidered it. And so they had it on a template. And I took that template to the printers to be put into production for the cover for Man Across the Water. And that was the original artwork. So it was just basically the back of a jean jacket, which I, to this day, found quite fascinating. And then the second story, which was the stupid little 16-year-old kid story. Across the street from Dick James Music, there was a young man with long, scruffy hair that had a record shop, literally a 4-minute walk from Dick James Music. And that young, scruffy kid was Richard Branson. And he had a record store called Virgin Records. And the reason that it was such a cool record store, like none I'd ever seen, this is way before HMV and all those stores, was he had a purple couch and about 6 people could sit on it. And on the purple couch, he had put these headphones. So you go in there and say, "Can I listen to this record?" And he'd put it on a vinyl record player, and he had all the music housed into these cans, and you'd listen, or you could go into an actual booth and listen to music. It was really quite amazing at the time.
Yeah.
And so I was asked to go and pick up a life-size cardboard cutout of Elton to stick in the record store entrance because it was up a flight of stairs. It wasn't street level. So I went in to the office to pick up this life-size cardboard cutout. Now, mind you, I used to pick up Elton's shoes He'd have all these incredible shoes made with wings on them and like silver boots with like huge wedges, like 6.5 inches, because he's very short. So it would make him all of a sudden from like 5'5", he would be like 5'9" or 5'10",
Hmm.
with the wedges. And so I had to pick up this life-size cardboard cutout from the printers and take it to Richard Branson's record store, but bring it to the office first just to get the approval. Now, unbeknownst to me, Elton and Bernie were back from their US tour. They just did a couple of shows at Carnegie Hall, and I didn't know that Elton was back in the office. So I went to the printers to pick this life-size cardboard cutout, and he also had a giant sombrero, like cowboy Mexican hat on, with the heels. It was almost 6 foot. I was given some money, like £10, to get in a black taxi. And so I remember the guy, looking out the window, and he's like, "You're not going to get that in here, mate." And I was like, "But I have to." I couldn't get on the subway with it. Can you imagine walking on the subway with this? Like getting it in the subway car,
Yeah.
let alone in a taxi. So he said, "Well, the cab driver goes, I'll tell you what, wind down the windows. And then if it's not sticking out too far, then I'll take you back," because I was only like 5 minutes away. So I put Elton's cardboard body in the taxi, but with the shoes and the head, it was like this. It was like an accordion. One would stick out and the other one would come in. So I thought, oh, hell. So I wound up the window hoping that the cardboard would just like bend enough for 5 minutes that I would be able to wind the window back down. And then what happened was we drove up the street, and then when I was about to get out the car, instead of winding the window down, I mistakenly wound it the opposite way,
Oof.
and I snapped its head off. So I walked into the record label, up the stairs. There's Elton with his feet on the table with Bernie and all the cast and crew of his record label. I had Elton's head underneath one arm and his torso under the other. And I walked in the room, and the place just burst out laughing. I thought, they're definitely going to fire me. And it was one of those moments that the people that worked at the record label never, ever forgot. And then I said to Stuart it was about right in COVID, I said, "Stuart, I don't know if you remember me. I'll send you the text and you can see what he said." I said, "I don't you remember me?" I said, "I was a messenger boy for Dick James Music. I was the guy that worked there from 1971. And he goes, "Were you the guy with the curly hair that snapped Elton's head off?" And I said, "Yeah, I was. That's me."
You don't
And
live that down.
he goes, "That's funny." He says, "Because for years after that, Elton's dad used his head as a dartboard."
Oh my God.
Yeah, they didn't have a
All right,
great
they have some
relationship back
issues,
then.
yeah. Well, let's talk about. I mean, your namesake song. I want to get into that for briefly. I mean, you're in the studio with them. Joey starts this guitar riff. It becomes a song. I mean, that's the legend, is that it was written in the studio. Chris Thomas called it early punk, and then the next thing you know, it's named after you on the record. Did you have any idea before it came out that how
No,
where did that name come from?
I didn't have a clue. I didn't know until I saw it. And then again, they spelled my name wrong.
Yeah.
There's a video out on YouTube. I don't know if you've seen it. It was Joey playing a club in Minnesota, and he said, "This is a song, Andy Norris." And Andy Norris, he was a tape operator at Olympic. Olympic. This is Joey like talking on the song. And it's a really great rendition of the song. But no, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about it until it came out. And then years after, I think it was Michael Camino. Michael had a thing called Cottage Views. I don't know if he still does it. I guess Joey thought my name was Norris, not Morris. And then there was a little thing that Kathy had written about the song because someone else like yourself had asked about the song. Yeah, it's a cool little song, man. I mean, I'm very grateful that I will be forever entwined in that Badfinger history with that song. But it's a cool little rock and roll song. He was a great rock and roll player, Joey.
Yeah, it's a great finale. I mean, it's an encore song. I don't think they ever played it as Badfinger, but in '79 he was already playing it with Tommy in the reformed Badfinger, and it's just such a great closer. But in terms of the title, because the title is such a weird non sequitur. I mean, I did want to
Well,
get your
nothing to
opinion
do
on
with
it.
me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and Joey's a little bit of a troll. You could always see that, glimmer in his eye too when he'd say they deadpan kind of say something. It's a Liverpudlian humor.
Yeah.
Because I've seen your comments over time that he knew who you were, and it was like someone at the label maybe misspelling it, and I've heard Joey be like, "No, I really thought that was his name. I had no idea." So, what kind of at this point, which one do you think is the truth? If you had to bet on it, you think he knew and it was his joke?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I think that was him, that was a great side of his humor.
And then I wanted to ask you about Mark Moffat.
One of my closest friends, and that was a real kick in the stomach to lose him in October, and then to lose Joey in March. It was or February. It was no. Mark and I met in Nashville about 24 years ago. He was working in a guitar shop in London in 1970 when I was working with Elton's label at the time, and he remembers Badfinger and all the guys walking in and buying their guitars, and Mark would basically Mark was probably, I don't know, he's probably 18 at the time. He's from Sydney, Australia. I mean, it took a lot of balls to fly all the way from
Yeah.
Sydney at 18 and land in London working in a record store. So he met all those guys, from like Clapton and all those guys. He would work with them, Rory Gallagher, Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy, and Badfinger. And he had stories. So I hooked him up with Joey, and they had met in Nashville a few years back. But one of the people that I introduced Joey to just recently, and he just texted me, and he's a dear friend of mine, is Pat Sansone, and Pat is in the band Wilco. He's the second guitar player in Wilco, and he was a huge Badfinger fan. And he said, "Oh man, he goes, could you ever introduce me to Joey Mollen one day?" And I said, "Of course." So I guess this is about 9 years ago, I met Pat, and I think I met Pat in 2003, and Joey was playing in Chicago, and it was a big blizzard, and Pat and Joey hooked up in this bar, and I got a picture of them actually, of Joey and Pat, and Pat was just absolutely blown away that he got to meet Joey because he's a huge Badfinger fan. And see, it's funny, man, isn't it? Because they're
Yeah.
such a different band, but when you get to know Pat as a guitar player and as great as a player and a writer that he is, he's a huge Badfinger fan.
Yeah. So then, yeah, you mentioned also you've been working on trying to get Badfinger in the Hall of Fame now since, I don't know, 2017, maybe before then. Is there
I've
anything
been
we can do? Is there like a public service announcement I can get out there if there's a petition or anything we can do to help?
Well, I have been looking into it. There's a guy that used to work at ASCAP. His name's Tom DeSavia. He wrote a book. It was up for a Grammy about punk rock with John Doe. They wrote a book about punk music in LA in the 70s, when Madame Wong's and all these clubs were like huge in LA at the start of the punk scene. And I asked him about Badfinger because he's a huge Badfinger fan. And Loretta Munoz is a very close friend of mine. She's like one of the ambassadors of music in the music industry, period. And in LA, everyone knows Loretta Munoz, ASCAP. And I bounced it off various people, in publishing and like Loretta and other people. And what I've gotten back is it's so political to get, like I said, that band on the radar. Can it be done? I'm sure it can be done. But what I am going to do is I'm going to find out from some other people if there is someone I could meet with. Like Loretta Munoz is on the board of Norris, National Recording Academy, because I'm really good at opening doors. If someone tells me you can't, I'll find a way to do it. So, yeah, and I asked Joey a few times, I mean, I've asked Joey if I said, Joey, I'm going to try and see if I can get you in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I said, he's like, okay, Andy, go for it, man. You know,
Sounds like
uh,
Joey, yeah.
and I thank you, man, for
Yeah.
reaching out to me.
Well, thank
But
thank you for answering the call of duty from Badfinger fans. All right, well,
sounds
thanks
good,
again,
man.
Andrew. I really enjoyed it.
Okay,
All right,
buddy.
have a good one. Take care.
All right.